Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to my review for Half-Life 1 and its expansion packs. This is a game, and a franchise more broadly speaking, that is definitely very important to a lot of people. And I recognize that maybe this was somebody's first game. Maybe this was somebody's first FPS. Either way, it obviously, very clearly, self-evidently, has a lot of value to a lot of individuals on a subjective level. And I wanted to bring that up because we're leaving that baggage at the door so that we can really talk about this game's objective successes and failures. Mostly failures, as you're about to find out, if you don't already know. And this is not to say that I have absolutely no understanding of or respect for what the game ended up creating. Maybe we can get into that later, but it's really not the point of this review. I actually have a couple of other video pieces based around the impact of Half-Life and similar titles that I'm going to eventually produce. But again, this review is just looking at this game and how it was as a title, objectively. And what do we mean by objectively? Well, if you're new to this concept, right? If you're not really inculcated into how I speak and what I like to break down, as we did get a couple of newcomers who had never really heard dissenting opinions about Half-Life until they came into my stream and watched me play, I feel like it bears repeating here, in a very quick way so as not to waste my more veteran, grizzled audience members' time. When you're looking at how something is executed, there's a certain amount of efficiency that you can have in your execution. So, if you have the intent as a developer to make a narrative-driven game, and in your execution, you have a character that doesn't fucking speak, and so you're not actually able to ever provide any characterization for this character, and as a result, the player is never able to feel anything for this character because they're not a character, they're a viewport. That would be an example of poorly executed characterization and character design. So in this case, we're not talking about we don't like it subjectively. What we're analyzing is why it broke down and what made it inefficient. That's what makes something objectively bad. It literally just means inefficiencies are present within the execution. So, with this in mind, again, hopefully we can leave any emotional or nostalgia-based baggage at the door when we launch into this discussion. Some of the stuff I say is probably not going to be agreed upon by most people who listen to it, just by the virtue of the game being widespread commercial success and hailed critically and by its everyday average Joe players as a game that is very good. But I think it is an objectively bad title, because it's not very interactive when it doesn't want to be, thus not making it a game during those segments. Now, it is true that most titles don't have completely uninterrupted gameplay. Many titles have cutscenes or on-rails sections where the player choice is restricted or removed in favor of allowing them to sit back and observe something. In Half-Life, it had non-cutscene cutscenes, where you weren't really able to move around the map and do anything, progress in the level. You just had to wait for some scripted event to finish. I often refer to these as set pieces when playing the game. But set pieces also can mean other things, like a very linear level that you progress forward and experience in one direction, and are never really expected to backtrack in. However, our definitions of set pieces might get muddied if we use it for a lot of different things. So when I refer to set pieces in this review, I'm mostly going to be talking about cutscenes. Even though those aren't really cutscenes by the definition, they're set pieces. They force you to remain restricted within a certain environment, and they are cinematic in nature. So, the cinematic set pieces of Half-Life include the train ride that the game is almost infamous for, I would say. Many people, for some reason, point to this particular experience of sitting in a train and waiting for gameplay to come to you as some sort of selling point for the game, as if this is a good thing, when in fact it starts off on precisely the wrong foot if you're trying to make something that is a game. Maybe you could see a movie where a character you're supposed to follow is on a train, and as he's going through the train, you're getting some information fed to you, and that information helps you understand the setting of this new and interesting setting, world, fucking research facility, whatever the case may be. that may be a concept that you can execute well with. I don't see much originality in that, but I also don't see ways where you can argue that it's got no merit whatsoever. But that's in a movie. This is a game. We're meant to be interacting. And we're not interacting when we're sitting there listening to stuff. Despite the fact that we can move back and forth between the train, it's a cutscene for all intents and purposes. So this set piece, for one, is very long. For another, serves only to exposition us elements of the world that we are now residing in. And as a third, because three, point, I do have to mention that in general, it gave the impression that the priority of the developers was not to design a game, but to tell a story. And that is an impression I was not able to shake during any of my playthroughs later on. Playing Half-Life is difficult not because the game is old or inaccessible or anything that some people may say about the game. It's difficult because you are not allowed to play the game for very long before getting interrupted by some set piece, some scripted sequence of events where, yes, technically you do have player control, although there were admittedly some actual cutscenes that you can't argue about, where you were being dragged around and thrown into a garbage heap or something. Ironically, that's where all of the games, copies of this game come from. But outside of that, you do have player control for all of these set pieces. You just wind up sucking dick for most of it because you literally can't do anything else. So as a result of this weird linear, not even level design, because again, it's not interactive, you are forced to wait for the developer to say, okay, you can go now, you can play our game. And this is something that permeates the game. And so that's why I say playing the game is difficult. And I would say that this is objectively bad design. This is objectively bad design for a video game. Obviously, it having interactive elements would make it an objectively poor design choice for a movie as well, because movies are not meant to be interactive in that sense. But you fail to ever find footing as a player trying to play a game. You have no gameplay loop to speak of, because yes, there are some elements that are consistent, like you fighting certain enemies that make repeated appearances, like the zombies and head crabs and everybody else in the bestiary, barring some boss battles. But besides that, and besides using weapons that you're familiar with, a lot of the other game rules change a lot. Your objective can go from killing a bunch of enemies in a room to platforming, to trying to avoid some environmental danger, to having to platform over some environmental danger while shooting some enemies. And while there are some elements of the game that may be more compelling when you combine bits and pieces here and there, and maybe when you combine multiple, enemy types in the same room and have a composition of enemies that the player fights against, there can be some pockets of engagement. The fact that there's no consistency makes it incredibly difficult for you to feel like what you are able to do as a player is learn a consistent pattern that will bring you success. And then this is a sticking point for me, because even though I'm not the best player in any franchise and any type of game, I still would like all of the results that I get to be about me, about my skill, a reflection of my skill or lack thereof. Now, you can't solve for when set pieces randomly break stuff. You can't solve for when bugs happen. You can't solve for any of that when trying to analyze and assess your skill and what you did wrong when you lost, or what you could have done better even if you did eke out a victory. And that is another sticking point with Half-Life, where most of your deaths are not something that you can really learn from. Most of your mistakes are not something that you can do better next time, because after you clear the area that you're in, there is not going to be a next time. There's not going to be a next time where you're facing the same threats in the same organization. This isn't just a, pedantry. This isn't just me splitting hairs. This is an admission that the game itself is designed around encounters that are going to be unique the first time through. Now, that sounds great on paper, but again, that's more movie logic than game logic. Because what's supposed to be consistent in a game is how you play the game, and yet you can't play Half-Life consistently. I'm thinking not only of platforming sections, but just the way that enemies are laid out in a very specific order. It's not just that they have certain compositions. In fact, most of the game is spent facing the same enemy type over and over again, with only occasional points where they merge groups of enemies together and have them attack you all at once, or in any degree of organizational sort of aptitude, which you'd think would happen considering this is supposed to be an alien invasion with at least some military concert behind it. But it does not feel like a concerted attempt to actually invade anything and do anything, and so the entire premise of the game begins to fall apart the second you look at it. Some people will say that this is intentional because of some weird external lore that justifies it, because these guys were actually running from the Combine who were introduced in the next game. But I don't really care about that because I haven't played the next game. I'm just explaining how I feel when I'm playing the game. The message that I get is that the game is explicitly telling me that this is an alien invasion, and yet I'm experiencing a very discombobulated environment where there's technically aliens invading this realm, but they're doing nothing. They're just waiting for me to walk into a room so they can play a scripted animation and then look at me and shoot me. And that sometimes they don't even do the scripted animation part, and sometimes they don't even do the look at me and shoot me part. So it's horribly inconsistent. Yes, that's probably because of a bug, but you can't take the bug out of the game in this example, because we played a game and it had the bug. So, while I can separate that and say that's probably not what the developers intended, and feel safe in that assumption, I still have to come away from the experience understanding that this is how the aliens act. And the aliens do act very dumb. For aliens that have achieved warp technology or abilities, and some very interesting changes of technology compared to humans, forgetting about everything else that we find out when we actually go to their realm. So, yeah, certainly peculiar. Not what you would expect out of the franchise whatsoever. So coming away from the base game of Half-Life, which of course ends with Gabe Newell's aborted son, I'm not really sure what the point of it all was. Because the story itself concludes with G-Man fiddling with his tie and giving you a false dichotomy of a choice, where you either play Halo Reach's final level, where you die over and over again, or you make the correct choice and you get the credits. Except in my case, I didn't even really get that because the game glitched. So that was cool. But that has nothing to do with the actual invasion, or at least it doesn't feel like it does. See, this is where things can veer off into the realm of subjectivity, which is why I am saving a more detailed analysis of the game's impact and certain elements where I can provide more details and I can script out a video and be a little bit more controlled with my language and with the word choice that I use so that we don't veer off into subjectivity when discussing this stuff. But if the intention of the developers, when it comes to this story, was to write a story that feels like it concludes in a proper way, they failed horribly. They used some very inefficient, i.e. objectively poor, writing decisions and tropes. And at the end of the day, it doesn't feel like you resolved anything. You scarcely know what you're doing and why you're doing what you're doing, let alone feel like you're motivated by whatever Gordon Freeman is motivated by. He just wordlessly accepts objectives from people who seem to know what they're talking about, but also talk like they've been lobotomized. The voice acting is very bad in this game. Looking past that, you still have the problem of trying to reason out why you're doing what you're doing, even once you realize what you are doing in the first place, like activating some shit related to, human technology. That's in one of the expansion packs. Or in the base game, indeed, fighting a giant fetus. You don't really get any clarity as to why you have to kill that thing. You don't really understand why you're there at all. You just know that you're doing it, and the mission won't end until you kill the boss. So I guess you have to kill the boss. It's a very bizarre way of telling a story. I think that you want to tell simple stories in video games first, before you try to reinvent the wheel. Because at this point, game developers, and their writing departments more specifically, haven't even figured out what the wheel does. They are cavemen clubbing themselves with their own penises, trying to figure out how to write a sensible script. And it rarely does anything but intercept the gameplay that you're actually going to experience. And so every time we were treated to one of these scripted set pieces where we're not allowed to move around beyond what the developer allows us to move around in, and we have to wait for a certain event to finish before we can proceed. And every time our environment was changed on the whim of getting us to the end of that level because that's what the script says we have to do, and every time the level was designed in such a way where we had to progress in a very linear fashion from point A to point B so that we could advance the plot, this is the story sabotaging the gameplay experience and making us feel like we have nothing to choose ourselves. We just have to choose what the developer laid out in front of us, and eventually we've got to get there. Now, yes, of course, eventually you're going to have to satisfy the game's win conditions, but you can make it feel a lot more open and a lot less linear, and it really would not have taken that much effort. Yet at the end of the day, we still suffer, and we still repent for our crimes of starting the game in the first place. At the end of the day, playing Half-Life doesn't feel like a real, well-rounded experience. Not just because the story doesn't end in anything sensible, not just because you never really know what the fuck you're doing in any of the story, but also because of a very peculiar issue. It's an issue that I haven't actually seen in too many other games. Like, yes, the Metro games that I've played recently have very, very poor pacing. And Half-Life, of course, suffers from this, as I mentioned with the cutscenes and, well, the pseudo-cutscenes, the set pieces. As well as, of course, the linear level design and changing up the gameplay mechanics required to complete the mission. Your task list changes with every level and many times in the level, and it's not just literally what you have to do to win, it's how you get to that finish line that you can cross that changes dramatically. And so your strategy has to be malleable, but oftentimes the mechanics are changing completely. For example, gravity and acceleration and stuff like that changes wildly when you're in the void, Zen. And once you're out of the Zen area and back into a normal reality, well, obviously that's a bit of a slingshot, isn't it? Because you may have just gotten used to moving and controlling gravity in that environment only for it to be taken away from you. That's what happened to me. And then you take a step away from that, and you realize it's even worse than you thought. Because the final boss, and in fact most of the game, or most of the final section of the game rather, is done in the void, where there is no fucking gravity, and these bouncing pads that you used in the real world, in the standard world, we'll say, behave completely differently than you thought. So you wind up in a very toxic environment. And I say toxic, I don't use that word lightly. What I mean is that the developers, deliberately or otherwise, are employing mechanics that are definitely not cut out for what we need. They are employing changes to the mechanics that we've already been using, and they are expecting the player to master that in very little time at all. Sometimes literally impossible to master these mechanics without having played the boss beforehand. All while dealing with an enemy encounter that you've never had before, you will never have again, admittedly it is the final boss in this case, and have very little time to adapt to its moveset. So, where exactly is the consistency? Where exactly are we learning on past lessons? We don't even know how to move in this area, let alone deal with the enemy's attacks, let alone understand what the fuck its void cannon does, let alone figure out how to move around in this environment to begin with these very specific gimmick pads. It's not just that we have to move around in general, it's also that we have to move around using a gimmick that we've used before, but it acts completely differently in this area due to the change in gravity. So we've got to relearn all this stuff as we're trying to learn the final boss's movesets. Of course we're going to die a lot. And then you take a step away from that, and you realize that this is intentional. It must be, because the developers wouldn't have designed this encounter to be so unique otherwise. They wanted it to be unique. At least I can reverse engineer that much. And so all I can think of is it really must have been an intentional decision to change up the game rules so much so that the final encounter felt more unique, lasted in people's minds a little bit longer. I reject the hypothesis that you need to change things up to get a breath of fresh air, a change of pace. I feel like this is pointless. If you don't like the game that you are playing, yet that game is consistent, then that game is not for you, regardless of its quality. It could be a game that is very bad, and you don't like it because it's bad. It could be a game that's very good, but you still don't like it because subjectively, to your taste, you're not a fan of that game's mechanics, or what have you. That is a fair reason to avoid playing a game, to not complete it, to move on with your life. But when a game changes its own mechanics, when a game changes its own pacing, when a game flips the script on the player so much, it no longer feels like a game. It's not consistent. It doesn't allow you to learn from your mistakes, to capitalize on your successes. It introduces an element of seemingly random luck, where you're not really sure what's going on, and as a result, it takes a lot longer for you to really learn how to master the environment. And if it's done in the case of Half-Life, it's in a linear, set-piece driven narrative of a game. And then you just have to suck it up and realize that the only way that you can really show how much you've learned at the end of the day is to play the game again, a second time, which I'm not doing. So, what can we take away from Half-Life? What did it inspire in terms of the feelings that we had? And this is, again, definitely where we veer into more subjective territory. It's not just confusion, where we were definitely confused with the story. But I definitely think there's an element of frustration that happened in this game that didn't really happen in other games. That certainly didn't have to happen in the game at all. But a frustration that I haven't experienced too frequently when it comes to video games. Now, fans of my channel will know I am a steeled man. I have played a lot of very bad games and custom content as well. So for Half-Life to elicit such a visceral response from me as it did several times over, there must have been something really weird about the game. It's possible that maybe the game just rubbed me the wrong way. All the wrong ways. But it's more likely that the game has something fucked up with it than it's a very special case. Because I definitely would have been able to figure out if it was just the game. And it was more of a subjective issue, where I wasn't taking to its systems too kindly. Its systems are relatively simple, unlike its story. But it does change its systems all the time. This was one of the least consistent and most buggy FPS games I've played to date. I say that having played the Metro games, Duke Nukem Forever, and I'm sure several other games that would classify as an inconsistent mess. I just come away from Half-Life feeling like the developers were throwing shit at the wall, waiting for something to stick, and when nothing did, they just pressed compile. Of course, I can't know if the game was more stable on an earlier patch or had a later patch than what I played on that fixed some of the issues. I can't know if the Steam version was paradoxically better, even though it changed so much and was a shit show. But man, Half-Life was not a fun experience whatsoever. And some of the environments, some of the levels in this game, people were telling me that certain things like, for example, surface tension, which opens with a fucking helicopter gimmick, were some of the more acclaimed areas in the game. I can't imagine that at all. I thought that was one of the weakest areas, precisely because it has a gimmick flying above you, raining death on you. You can avoid it, in which case it kills you eventually, odds are. Or you can kill it, only if you didn't expend all of your ammo in your gimmick gun. So it's a quick time event, basically. It might not be in real time, per se. Maybe you can fail it as many times as you want, looking at how many times I kept dying to it. But ultimately, it has a very specific counter. So it's a hard counter at the very least, which at that point is basically a puzzle or a Simon Says, where you have to do what the developer lets you do so that you can get your cookie and your pat on the head. But I think it classifies as a QuickTime event in the sense that in order to progress without being really hindered, you have to push these buttons. It's not so much that you have to left click on somebody's head. I'm not saying shooting an enemy and under normal circumstances is a QuickTime event. It's more that you have to shoot on a very specific enemy, left click on a very specific enemy, with a very specific weapon equipped, or you're just going to be in for a really rough time. And I think that's not really an accurate depiction of most of the game. Like, it's not a microcosm per se. But it definitely felt like a lot of the set pieces in that game boiled down to that. And that one was only maximally frustrating because I didn't have any ammo in my gimmick gun. Of course, there were some areas in the expansions that played up on this even more, and were even more frustrating as a result. But I do think that Opposing Force, in a paradoxical sense, had a better game state, even though it had worse levels, than the base game. By game state, I simply mean the tools that the player had at their disposal, in terms of the number of weapons and such, and the enemies that they introduced. Now, admittedly, the enemies that they introduced, the way that they introduced them was very poor. They executed very poorly with their concepts, and their execution of the units may have been respectable if it had been in an environment where there were more interesting compositions, and if those enemies didn't have broken AI, didn't fumble inside walls, as Tony famously did in the entirety of the second segment of Opposing Force, and also didn't just break all the time, irrespective of Tony's specific example, and just not acquire targets. To me, this is an inexcusable issue. AI drives most of the engagement in your game. You'll really only see this level of lazy AI design in linear set-piece-driven stories that are masquerading as interactive software because of the fact that if they had put the effort into designing the AI, they wouldn't have to make set pieces. The AI would engage the player enough and would be much more replayable as a result. Not only that, but it would be consistent because the units would behave relatively similarly to how they always behave. They may play off of different allies differently if they're in a different composition or squad, but for the most part, enemies will behave consistently and competently. They will give the player a genuine challenge. They won't be, constantly breaking all the time, so there will be less bugs, which will immediately suck any immersion the player may be getting as a result of everything else going on in the game. So it's just a better solution entirely. And then you can design intelligent levels for your AI and your player to play around in. And you don't need set pieces. You don't need the player to only progress through your game world in one direction the entire time. With the very, very seldom example of the that giant tentacle boss where I had to throw grenades at it. I forget the name of it already. But I could go two different ways in that area. So that turns out to be an example of this not happening, an exception to the rule. But for almost all the game, you progressed in one way, and one way only. Occasionally backtracking only when you had achieved a certain part of the puzzle that was the solution to this grand conspiracy of a video game. So at the end of the day, Half-Life was not a very enjoyable experience. Its expansions had some interesting ideas, but ultimately fell apart due to the very poor execution, even though the concepts themselves and the tools the player had at their disposal were a little bit more interesting. I certainly would have liked to see the game state of Opposing Force used in a much more intelligent manner. Certainly some enemies and some weapons are weaker than others. For example, I think Tony probably should have been removed entirely. But if you made all of the AI more aggressive, more competent, and play off of each other, and then designed some interesting encounters with different compositions, while also having levels feel much more open, you would have had a much better game on your hands. At least the recipe for a better experience than the set-piece-driven, linear, narrative disaster that this game ended up being. So, I hope I laid out my case relatively coherently. And as I mentioned before, I will be producing some videos in the hopefully near future where I go through the impact that this game has had in a historical sense to the games industry. And I explain why I don't think it was a positive impact. And I will hopefully counter some of your favorite YouTubers and analysts' views on this title. So in that vein, if you have a positive review or analysis of Half-Life 1 or Half-Life as a franchise, and you want me to tackle it, leave it in the comments or reach out to me on Discord, as I am looking for respected analysts in the YouTube commentary environment, which is kind of a laughingstock in and of itself, so that I can use their videos to understand what other people actually enjoyed about Half-Life, and thus respond to it a more learned individual without potentially strawmanning their opinions or their positions. And also in that vein, if you yourself are still not yet convinced, or you would simply like to share an anecdote as to why you yourself enjoyed Half-Life back when you were a wee lad and hadn't yet grown up to watch Pronogo's YouTube videos on the internet, please leave your testimony in the comments section so that I can come away a more learned individual and understand why some people may have enjoyed this game while I very obviously did not. And hopefully I laid out my case without coming across as a complete asshole. I am trying to choose my words a little bit more carefully, stutter less, and ultimately have a more true-to-form review experience, where I give you guys my thoughts, but I focus mostly on objective things. Ultimately, my bias will creep in now and then. Of course, when I described AI-driven gameplay, that is certainly something that I prefer, and I do prefer more open levels. But I also think that these are objectively superior methods to designing a game, especially an FPS, than having hyperlinear, hyper-narrow, focused level design in general, I suppose. And as a result of that alone, I would feel dishonest if I wouldn't mention those things. So, again, hopefully you found this review enlightening. At the very least, even if you don't agree with my points, you at least know what somebody who doesn't like this particular game, and so far, at the very least, this entire franchise, thinks and why they think it. So I will leave you with that. Bye.